Thank you, thank you. And once again, I'd like to say thank you to Darren for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with everyone today. Whilst the restrictions around coaching in England might have relaxed ever so slightly, being able to have meaningful conversations with like-minded individuals is still very, very difficult. So I feel quite privileged to be able to talk to you on two occasions to share some thoughts. And today it's going to be especially around something which has been quite a large part of my life for a little bit of time. The thoughts today have been born really out of research for my PhD, and it's still very much in development. But I hope to provide some insights into how we might prepare our athletes for pre-competition routines. Now, I have to be honest, I'm at the stage of pulling lots of disparate thoughts together. So the PhD is far from the finished product. So please do bear with me whilst I ramble somewhat. So, like my previous presentation, I'm hoping that this won't last any longer than 45 minutes, as 90 minutes over 2 sessions of me droning on is enough to put anyone off athletics for good. However, within these 2 sessions, within this session, I'm going to start to recap the key points of my last presentation, drawing together some of the key principles about how we might warm up our athletes within our training sessions. I'll then spend a little bit of time talking about some patterns that I found when analysing some data from World and Athletics Championships, specifically on field events. Specifically, I will share some analysis into which rounds of performance seem to produce winning efforts and which seem to have the most fouls, and maybe use that as a way of looking at how effective a warm-up might or might not be. I'll then talk a little bit about some of the challenges that athletes and coaches are presented with when athletes are in their pre-competition routines. I'll talk about how warming up is a challenge and requires athletes to follow particular sets of protocols in order to be at their best at the very start of a competition. I'll finish by talking about what strategies we could consider to help get the best results out of our pre-competition routines, and what we might do within our training sessions to maybe help with this. But before I start, I'll introduce myself, and I'm going to apologise first of all to those people who know me or those that were in attendance a couple of weeks ago. But I promise that I'm going to keep this bit nice and short, certainly a lot shorter than the last presentation. So I'm a coach education tutor for England Athletics, and I'm currently the North of England's regional coach lead for jumps and the North of the UK's Para Development Academy's jumps coach. And in these 3 roles, I have the privilege of meeting some very, very knowledgeable coaches who work with some very, very talented athletes from all over England and indeed the UK. Now, outside of athletics, because some of us do actually have a life outside of athletics, I'm employed by Leeds Beckett University, where I've worked since the year 2000. I'm currently the course director for sports studies and the foundation year courses, and help to lead staff that deliver the physical education courses within the School of Sport. Within that role, I've been lucky enough to be part of the team who conducted the biomechanical analysis of all of the events at the World Athletics Championships that were housed in London in 2017. Whilst that project did mean I was lucky enough to be part of one of the biggest biomechanics projects in the world, it also gave me an insight into competition and pre-competition strategies before and in between rounds of athletics performance in elite triple jump competitions. And my PhD, like I've said, is not yet complete. So I just need to make it clear that these are just my current thoughts, but I'm looking forward to sharing with you my findings so far. So, as promised, I will spend a few minutes recapping the main points that were covered in the presentation I delivered a couple of weeks ago. In that session, we talked specifically about potentially some different thinking around warming up in our training sessions, and we talked about how static stretches should be used with caution within our training session warm-ups. We talked about how static stretches may lead to a potential loss of peripheral temperature in the muscles through maybe heat transfer. And we also talked about how static stretches could have a negative impact on the potential power output, potentially negatively influencing performance. We did, however, go on to talk about how certain types of stretches done in the right way at the right time could increase the range of movement around a joint, and how for some groups, static stretches in a warm-up might actually be useful. And we finished our discussion on stretches by introducing a concept known as ramp to help frame our warm-ups. Now, as part of our discussion on ramp, we talked about how a warm-up needs to achieve maybe 4 elements. This would start with a heart rate and core body temperature raising activity, such as maybe jogging around an enclosed coned area, or maybe even performing 5 to 10 minutes worth of jump rope skipping. And this will be followed by a dynamic series of stretching activities that maybe activate and mobilize, that's the A and the M of ramp, the joints. Now, just giving Darren a bit of warning that we're going to need to load up the videos, because these dynamic movements would mimic key fundamental movements such as lunging or squats, such as the ones here. So Darren, if you could show those videos, that would be great, mate. So we can see some dynamic squatting activities now that might be part of a dynamic warm-up that activates and mobilizes, activates some muscles and mobilizes joints. And Darren, if you could show the lunge as well. So these are a couple of examples of the types of fundamental movement activities that might also double up as dynamic stretches within our warm-up. Thank you, Darren. Now, these have a technical focus to ensure that the body shapes are tight and braced. But the ramp warm-up finishes with a gradually increasingly high level of intensity. And the activities finish with a small number of repetitions of maybe the highest intensity. Now, these could be heavy squats, if you have access to such a facility, or they could be fast, short sprints, or even explosive plyometrics, such as multiple hops or even depth jumps with rebounds. One of the challenges that was set in the last delivery of mine was that this potentiating effect is initiated through lots of different types of activities and different intensities for different people. They also last for different lengths of time for different individuals, meaning that we need to figure out in training what the optimal time frame and the optimum exercises are for our athletes. And this is a really important point, and it's going to impact further upon the discussions when we talk about pre-competition preparation. Now, the last aspect that we discussed is how, with a few small tweaks, we can add much more value to our warm-ups. By organising the heart rate raising activity so the coach can see and hear our athletes, observations can be made and subsequently feedback can be given. These observations could be about how braced the torso is or how dorsiflexed the foot is, but they could also be an opportunity to reinforce a previously given technical point. So these heart rate raising activities are then followed by the dynamic stretches that are technically orientated, focusing upon key fundamental movements or shapes that underpin each of the events in athletics. And again, these dynamic stretches are observed and then offered feedback on. And if done appropriately, can also help develop range of motion, but then also strengthen our athletes. The important part of this is knowing what each of our activities can bring, and that helps us plan our warm-up to be much more than just a 15-minute preparation for the rest of the training session. So, my PhD, it's focused upon the rounds of athletics performance in field events in athletics, specifically to try and work out what the best warm-up and then re-warm-up strategies might be. My starting point was to access the publicly available data from the IAAF websites for both World and Olympic Championships for both male and female athletes. I looked at field events across all 6 rounds of final competitions to see if there are any patterns in how athletes performed, including which rounds their best performance or their best efforts were recorded in, and to see if there were any patterns within foul efforts. The reason I focused just upon finals is that although I could access qualification rounds for some of the World and Olympics, this was not recorded consistently before the year 2004, meaning that the data set would not have been large enough for me to have made any meaningful conclusions. Now, my thinking behind reviewing the rounds data was that this might have given me a clue as to what the most effective strategies to enhance performance might be prior to competition. Through reviewing pre-competition routines, one of the most significant impacts was that of the call-up period, as those seemed to be a compulsory element of top-level competitions which uninterrupted what would have been normal preparatory routines. Now, reviewing the literature, most of what's written about warm-ups and other preparatory interventions tends to follow a chronology which lends itself to toward reducing the variables that might influence a very scientifically orientated set of results, rather than reviewing what protocols that might prove to be most useful and effective within the field. Further to this, I want to look at something that can be done in a relatively small window after an athlete has been called up into the competition arena to prepare that athlete in the optimal way for the start of competition. To this end, I tried to look at what might have been done, I don't know, maybe before round one of a field competition, and then what might be done in between each of the subsequent rounds to maybe maintain the highest level of performance across all 6 rounds. So this led me to start to look at intermittent warm-up strategies, or re-warming up, as a vehicle to maintain best efforts. Now, one of the challenges of a PhD is that a key criteria is that it has to be innovative and something that no one else looked at. Now, re-warming up has been researched before, although this has mainly been done in the realm of team field sports such as American football and soccer, where the participants have initially warmed up in groups, with some players sitting on the bench for periods of time. And maybe soccer players, this period of time could be a full half, or more often up to about 60 minutes into a game, which could be punctuated by a 45-minute half-time. Whereas American footballers may rotate offensive and defensive players depending upon the outcomes of a particular down. Now, most of the research has focused upon maintaining core body temperature over longer periods of time than the 15 to 25 minutes that it would take for temperature to reduce in normal ambient temperatures, and that's about less than 25 degrees. There is little or no research into what re-warm-up strategies could be adopted by an athlete who wants to express the most amount of force 6 times in a controlled way in regular intervals over an hour to maybe an hour and a half's duration. So whilst this makes my research unique, which is an essential component of a PhD, it also means that what I'm looking at has really never been pulled together before, which is just that little bit scary. So this is what I've found, or at least some of it. This graph attempts to show the average rounds that a winning effort was recorded in across most of the field events split between males and females. I focused upon the throws and horizontal jumps, as these events all have 3 rounds of competition followed by 3 further rounds. The high jump and the pole vault allow athletes to enter the competitions at different heights, meaning that the time from warm-up and call-up to the first effort could vary from less than an hour up until maybe 2 hours into a competition. And this would mean that any subsequent analysis would be incredibly difficult to do. Now, at first glance of this graph, there doesn't really seem to be much happening across each of the rounds here. And in essence, there doesn't seem to be any patterns when it's presented like this. But what happens if we group males and females together and then just looked at each event in its totality? So when you start breaking things down like this, things get a little bit more interesting. The shot and the hammer throws both seem to be recording the winning throws in rounds 4, with the triple jump being far closer to round 3, with the long jump and the discus being somewhere in between. What's very, very interesting is that the javelin throw seems to produce winning efforts or winning throws far earlier in the competition than any other event. Now, upon further analysis, a couple of patterns tend to emerge. If you look at the averages of just the throws that could have rotational elements, the best efforts seem to be around the 4th round, or just after when that cutoff point would be for most field events. But when you compare this to the mean of the horizontal jumps efforts, you can see that these two events achieve winning groups much closer to round 3 or just before the cutoff point. Now, you could argue that this difference may be something to do with athletes wanting to make more of an effort close to the cutoff points to qualify for the final 3 rounds of competition. And there may be something in that psychological need to dial up one's efforts. But if this was the case, we would expect to see this trend across all of the different events, rather than there being a difference between these two groupings events. So something must be happening. What is also very interesting is that athletes in the javelin throw seem to be achieving the winning efforts far earlier than in any other event, with the mean winning effort being about halfway between rounds 2 and round 3. Now, athletes in the javelin throw are achieving their best efforts far, far earlier than in other throws, and approximately 2 rounds earlier than in the hammer throw. So what is it about the javelin throw that might be causing this particular phenomenon? There has to be something which is going on to produce such a marked difference in when these winning throws are achieved. Now, bear with me a minute or so while I try and unpick this slightly more complicated set of results. So what we've got here is information about the percentage of fouls within each of the rounds for each of the different events. So to help answer what might be going on, I looked again at the data set and tried to find if there were any other patterns. And like I've just said, this time I started to look at the fouls in each round. I looked to see if there were any patterns both between each of the events, but then also looked to see if there was anything interesting which had occurred within that particular event. Now, I have to point out that for some years that the data was available, the IAAF website did not differentiate between those efforts that were recorded as no jumps or throws, i.e. where there was some physical effort, but no distance recorded, and those instances where a pass was recorded. So it was impossible to differentiate prior to probably about 2004, once again, which was a pass and which was an effort that recorded no distance. It was only in later competitions where the data that is available provided this level of breakdown. So I have only really looked at those championships where this is available to pull together for this set of figures. Now, this means that the figures that are presented here represent the number of fouls rather than a combination of fouls and passes. So what's interesting when you look at all the events is that as the competition goes on, there seems to be an increase in the percentage of fouls. Now, if you look at the data and then run some numbers, the round that has the highest probability of a foul occurring is round 4, with approximately 33% of efforts resulting in a fouled attempt. Now, this seems to match fairly closely to the round that the winning efforts were actually recorded in. So there seems to be a relationship with when best efforts are recorded and the number of fouls when you look at all events. Now, there are some differences between men and women, with men recording more fouls in every round apart from round 3, where women record very, very slightly more. And there are some differences in total percentages of fouls across different events, with the shot recording the most, almost 36% of fouls across all rounds, compared to just around about 23% within the triple jump. However, when you analyse the individual rounds, there are some very interesting patterns that emerge, which might give us a clue as to what might be going on. For example, the event which records the winning effort the soonest is the javelin, with best efforts being recorded on average between round 2 and round 3. And if we look at the fouls data, less than 9% of the efforts in round 1 are recorded as fouls, compared to 19% recorded of all events in round 1. This lower number of fouls is also seen in round 2, where once again the javelin average percentage is lower than the events combined at 22.5 versus 26%. Now, if you continue to look at the patterns, after round 2, there is a change with the average number of fouls increasing beyond the average for all events, peaking in round 4 with almost 41% of efforts being recorded as throws. But again, there seems to be a chronological link between the winning efforts and the number of fouls, but this time with an inverse relationship, or with a lower number of fouls being recorded in the first few rounds, with further distances also being recorded. Something is definitely going on to see such a stark change. Now, I have to be honest and confess that I have just given a snapshot of the analysis from my PhD, as I go on to look at these relationships in much more detail. Further to this, because of my background, I focus solely on the triple jump in particular, mainly because this is one of the areas that I coach. But as I only have 45 minutes to talk, and I want to get to the implications of coaching, I'd better just limit to these things and then move on. So this leads us to ask a number of different questions. What is it about some events which means they are performing a little bit differently than others? Why are some groups achieving winning efforts far earlier than others? And why are some event groups having more fouls than others? Why do we see the shot having a total number of fouls close to 36%, with the triple jump only having around 23%? And why are some events like the javelin recording far fewer fouls, but a higher number of winning distances earlier in the competition? And for me, the biggest question is, what can we learn about this? And therefore, what can we plan with and for our athletes? For me, I think part of the answer lies into actually what goes on within international competition. And one of the biggest factors might be the timings of what actually goes on. Now, all athletes are allowed to warm up in a separate area and pretty much adopt whatever pre-competition warm-up routines they wish to. This could follow the same ramp principles that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. However, there are a few important differences that we need to consider. Firstly, the warm-up could normally finish 40 minutes, maybe an hour before the start of competition. And if you're due to jump or throw in the last round, this might be even longer. The warm-up is then followed by an extended call-up period, which may last between 20 and 40 minutes, depending upon the grade of competition and the event that you're in. Now, these call-ups tend to be in a space that are away from the warm-up arena and are often in relatively small areas, meaning that any form of warm-up activity can be incredibly difficult. Now, whilst there are seating areas for athletes to relax in, the amount of space that might be available for an athlete to perform warming up activities, let alone any potentiating activities, is incredibly limited. And due to the duration of this relatively sedentary period, there is a very real chance that the core body temperature of our athletes could decrease, along with any priming of movement skills that could have been previously done being lost. So for me, this is one of the biggest challenges to an athlete being competition ready for when they first start in round one. Now, another potential challenge for the athlete and coach is what to do straight after the call-up period, because there is a period of time that may be between 20 minutes and 60 minutes, depending upon the specific event and the grade of the competition, where the athletes are listed in the competition before the first effort in the first round of competition. Now, although on the face of it, this may seem like quite a long time, there's actually quite a lot for an athlete to do. For all athletes, there's the need to re-warm up, so get that core body temperature raised back up again and to start to reprime those muscles and to reprime those limbs before the start of the competition. For horizontal jumpers, there is the need to mark out run-ups and to check that they are correct to minimize the chance of a no jump. And for throwers, there is the need to feel the speed of the circle and gauge the wind. Further to this, there is also the need to maybe focus the mind upon the competition that might be to come. So what we do at each point is really, really important and may help our athletes be at the very best at the start of their competition. Now, there are lots of things that we need to be aware of, but throughout my PhD, I have chosen to focus upon 3 different areas as a focus for pre-competition strategies. The first is the effect of post-activation potentiation and how that could be used to both develop and maintain power throughout each of the rounds of competition. The second is a fairly well-established concept called warm-up decrement that both Anschel and Weisberg discussed in their paper about serving in between sets of tennis. Now, the principle may seek to explain potential decreases in the application of coordinated activities in between rounds, and in particular in round 1 and round 4 in athletics. And the third concept discussed by people like Didier and colleagues is how the context of a previously learnt skill may detrimentally affect the way these skills are being performed in a competition environment. And this is known as contextual interference of learning. As I mentioned in my previous talk, post-activation potentiation is a relatively new but emerging area of research. So whilst research has started not so long ago, it's quite topical at the moment, and if you Google it, you should be able to find quite a lot of readings about it. Now, it's a phenomenon that occurs after maximum muscular contractions and leads to significant increases in the amount of subsequent force that can be developed. It is thought that by people like Koop, that this increase in force production is the result of maybe an excitation of the nervous system resulting from a previous heavy loading. Now, that heavy loading was originally thought to be something like conducting heavy squats. However, more recent research by people like Makaruk have suggested that relatively moderate repetitions of plyometric exercises or even short sprints just before a powerful effort may lead to the same potentiating effect. Now, this effect has led to an increase of, in some studies, seen up to more than 4% in counter-movement jump performances. Now, counter-movement jumps are used as a pretty sound measure, as they seem to be an accurate measure of lower limb power. Now, the difficulty with post-activation potentiation, as I've previously mentioned, is that the type of exercise, the number of repetitions, and the intensities of the exercises that are needed to initiate this effect will differ per athlete. Similarly, the length of time that the effect lasts for may be different depending upon the activity performed or the intensity that it is at. Some research talks about the post-activation effect being felt up to 40 minutes after the initiating exercise. But other research suggests that it starts to dissipate after maybe only 20 minutes. Now, the challenge for us as coaches is if this is done at the very end of the warm-up, With the call-up being so long, it is quite possible that any potentiating effect of any exercises that are done in the warm-up will have disappeared by the first round of competition. But what we're starting to see now in research by people like Dinsdale and Bissas is that the effect of post-activation potentiation could actually be extended through repeated use of high intense activities throughout a competition. Now, as mentioned before, warm-up decrement is a phenomenon that's observed where levels of the quality of skills decrease following a period of passive rest. Now, according to people like Anschel and Weisberg, the accuracy of movement decreases as a result of a number of potential mechanisms, which include the reduction in levels of arousal, or the reduction in levels of focus, or even a subsequent misjudgment of where speed of movement starts to impact on the quality of movement for the learner. Now, this could be especially important within throws competitions or even jumps competitions, where there are several instances of prolonged inactivity where this loss of focus might occur. So warm-up decrement is a very real factor and something that we need to maybe factor in terms of interventions when our athletes are being sedentary and having a passive recovery. Now, for me, one of the most important things that could be going on is how a previously learnt skill might be being applied in a very different environment. Athletes will have performed their skills at their home venues, and they'll have done that a number of times where significant amounts of deliberate practice will have been performed, with many hundreds, maybe even thousands of throws or jumps having been done. Now, as hinted at previously, the relatively high number of fouls for some of the throws events, particularly at the beginning of a competition, could be a sign that the athletes are getting used to the speed of that circle or other environmental factors slightly later than in other events. Indeed, it's interesting to speculate that the javelin has slightly fewer contextual factors that influence the effectiveness of force application, and that can be evidenced through a relatively lower number of fouls in the first two rounds and earlier achievement of higher distances. So what are the implications? Well, as suggested earlier in this presentation and in the session on training warm-ups, we need to figure out what are the most effective potentiating activities for our athletes, and to figure out which of these need to be done at what time. It is likely that the potentiating activity at the end of our warm-up, pre-call-up, is not sufficient, as the timings might be too long to feel that effect. So what that means is that there will need to be some other form of potentiating activity, such as repeated hops or short flat-out sprints within the competition arena and prior to our first rounds. Now, again, timing is important, as the later you are to enter the competition, the later you can afford to do the potentiating activity when the athletes arrive either run-up or circle side. Similarly, it may be appropriate to do re-warm-up or potentiating activities in between rounds, and again, time so the window of that effect is felt within subsequent jumps. The challenge, of course, is that some of the event's competition efforts, such as maybe the triple jump, will actually lead to a potentiating effort in itself. So this means that it is even more important to work out what activities lead to that effect and how long it is before our individual athletes start to feel that effect dissipate. Now, the second implication for us to consider is to what we can do to minimize the effect of warm-up decrement and the negative impact that the call-up process has on the skill application for our athletes. Now, research has been conducted on the effect of visualization to minimize the effect of warm-up decrement, along with the effect of in-place activity-specific movements. So whilst it might not be possible to replicate the whole skill within a call-up, we know through research that performing some element of that skill may be sufficient to reduce warm-up decrement's effects. Furthermore, it becomes even more essential that some related skill activities are performed within the competition arena to refire the neurological pathways that make up the whole skill. And this could be done in between each round to try and minimize the skill loss throughout the competition, particularly if some of the athletes do choose to pass on particular rounds. And finally, when our athletes get into the competition arena, it is important for them to be able to feel this new environment that the skills are about to be performed in. They need to feel the run-up or the circle whilst they're in the process of running, jumping, or throwing, to adapt to the skill that they may have learned in their own relatively safe environments. This means that 1 or 2 full throws rather than just standing throws, or 1 or 2 full jumps rather than short approach jumps, may help to increase the contextualized learning and then help our athletes to adapt to that new environment. It also means that we need to build into our athletes an ability to be resilient to different contexts and to help them to learn how to learn quickly and then be autonomous. Now, that means we need to set our athletes challenges. And we need to get them to train in different conditions to get used to those different conditions. They need to compete at different venues with different types of surfaces so they learn how to adapt. In fact, one of my very good friends who passed away not so long ago talked about how he would use cold competitions with his British swimmers, where athletes or swimmers were put into meeting conditions as soon as they arrived at training with no prior warning. Now, his philosophy was that training is supposed to prepare our athletes for competition. And he used to say, why not mimic the conditions of a competition actually within training? Now, in order to help differentiate, what we could do is to make the winner, if you like, be the person who records the best efforts relative to their personal bests rather than recording the best distances. And to do that just after 1 round of competition. So in this way, the focus of that one particular training session is solely on the pre-competition routines for our athletes. So I guess to summarize, I have 3 take-home questions. The first question is, what activities lead to the longest lasting, but then most effective potentiating effect? So what activities can we take into our warm-up arenas and then into the field to help our athletes develop the highest amount of power and then maintain that power level throughout the competition? The next question is, how can we prevent warm-up decrement when our athletes are required to be relatively sedentary during the call-up period and are likely to have relatively sedentary periods in between the rounds of competition, especially when some athletes might choose to pass in between each of our rounds? And the third and final question is, how can we develop resilience in our athletes to help them prepare for the different environments that our athletes may be asked to perform within? So, over the next few slides or so, I've captured some readings that I've used to pull this presentation together and indeed come from my PhD research, which I'm sure you're going to be able to read at your leisure after Darren has shared this with you next week. But for now, I guess all that's left for me to say is thank you for your time. And does anybody have any questions?
Great, Jamie. Thank you very much for that. That was excellent. You can have a slight breather while I fire
Thank
up
you.
the questions. The first question is going to come from, I think it's going to come from Dominic, actually. It's going back to what you said earlier on, Jamie, providing a definition of activation and potentiation, differentiating with a few examples on the effects on muscles of each, please.
Of course. So post activation potentiation is an effect that the body feels after a very high level of intensity of activity. So this could be heavy squats, or it could be like plyometrics, so hopping or bounding or depth jumps. And for throws, this could be throwing a heavy medicine ball, or it could be producing, I don't know, a bench press type activity. And then that potentiating effect is then felt for between 20 and 40 minutes after that particular activity.
Cool. I think just to add to that, I think it's, preparing physically but also mentally what's to come as well. So you're preparing that athlete's mind for that next session. And in terms of it's really about replicating those movements, I think. Jamie, would I be right? Those movements that reflect what's to come.
Absolutely. And some of the principles about that warm-up decrement and that contextualized interference of learning could be trained out of our athletes if we have those potentiating activities which are relatively close to the skills that we're about to perform in competition. So the example would be that triple jump. So it would make sense for a triple jumper to do a series of multiple jumps, hop, step, and jump to help with that potentiating effect within the arena.
There was one thing that I noted down that I thought was really relevant was in terms of certainly for jumps and throws, you start to now think about the tactics within your warm-up. So knowing which order you're jumping in. So an athlete who's starting the competition, who's the first up, versus the person in a 15 athlete field who's at the end, that could have almost 10 to 15 minutes of difference between their first jump, and therefore that person who's jumping last may have a slightly different warm-up timing strategy compared to the person who's jumping first, who may need to finish the warm-up that much earlier so that they can do their final preparations, fix their socks, tie their laces, all that kind of stuff before the first attempt. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the IAAF rules, it allows for 1.5 minutes, I think, worth of time between each of the efforts. It's going to be less than that because people rattle through it. But you're right, that does mean there's a significant amount of time between the start of the competition and when the last person in the first round might go. So I think you're right. You need to give some thought about how that strategy might change.
And there's a question here just relating to the sprinting. What is the warm up between round and a sprinting events? But if we look at some of the major championships and some of the Grand Prix now, athletes are doing their final warm-ups, the final checking the blocks, they do a couple of runs out of the blocks, and then they go and disappear behind the curtain for 10 minutes until the television's ready for them to come out and do the showcase event. So we're now starting to see kind of potential new interventions or strategies for athletes warming up in that. Do you care to comment on that?
Absolutely right, but I think it's really important for those athletes to do full efforts out of the block, so it's not just setting them up and then a bit of an amble out. It's about trying to potentiate using that 100% effort and maybe even punctuate with a couple of plyometric exercises.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So is that answered Jordan's question in terms of warming up between rounds and sprinting events? Because it's slightly different after a run, first round in the sprint. They kind of go through the mixing zone and then have to go through that whole process again. So
absolutely, and depending upon whether you're talking about round 1 into round 2 or maybe semis to final, there might be vastly different timings about how long an athlete might be having to wait between rounds. For the field events, it's going to be about 15-20 minutes depending upon the size of the field and how quickly you might rattle through. Might be half a day for sprint events and rounds of those competitions.
Chrissy has got a brilliant question here. We talk about exercises as different interventions, but looking at nutrition and diet, and if you've got kind of low and high blood sugar levels through the hypo and hyperglycemia, You know, are there any research that has an impact on that, Jamie?
There probably has been, but I'm gonna properly dodge this bullet and say that it's not anything that I've read. So, really great question. What I'll probably do, Chrissy, if that all right, is if you're happy for me to have your email address, is I'll do a bit of research and I'll send you a couple of articles that might help answer your question. Unless Darren wants to.
No, would that be something that would feed into your PhD study, Jamie?
It could, but the focus of my PhD, because things need to be quite narrow, the 3 area of focus that I'm choosing to look at is post-activation potentiation as a primary driver, and then things like warm-up decorum and contextualized interference learning, rather than some of the nutritional elements.
Cool. Dennis posed a question earlier on about, you know, when you're just, I think it's for clarification around your winning effort. Do you mean the best effort of the winner or the best effort of all the athletes?
So this is the data that I've shown today was the winning effort to win the competition, but the data within my analysis for the triple jump stuff, I also looked at the best efforts from the athletes.
Cool. Elizabeth, she's seen some reports or research on potentiation effect from doing squats in the days before jumps competition. And that some people have seen a 3 or 5 days after performing these exercises. Is there a link between something a few days before and doing it in a warm-up situation, or just much better doing it as part of the warm-up?
Yeah, I mean, there is some research about doing a very limited number of very heavy weights in that short window of a couple of days before competition. But that doesn't tend to initiate a post-activation potentiation effect. It's more to do with tonus, so like a stiffness around the muscle joints and tendons, which is needed to exert power. Post-activation potentiation is slightly different.
Okay, here we go. Here's the next one. Great question from Penny. Thoughts on warming up for combined events? We have maybe 4 or 5 events Monday.
Really difficult to gauge because the level of fatigue that an athlete's going to feel after each of those 2 days, or if it's like a younger athlete performing multiple events in a single day, then these sorts of potentiating effect activities need to be entered with caution, because the amount of time that you've got to recover and the overall loadings across a very short period of time might mean that the game is reducing efforts and loadings as opposed to adding.
Again, it's all about timing. You know, some of them, it's, you know, they go from one event to the other and you get 20 minutes, which is, you know, it's more about refueling perhaps than that. Okay. Is there any correlation between limit warm-up in the arena for throwers and their throws between throws?
I mean, this was something that I observed, although I haven't read any research on it. At the World Athletics Championships, I just kept an eye out for the sorts of warm-up protocols that the athletes were engaged in, and I'd earmarked those that were doing full throws and full jumps within their warm-up, and then waited to see how well they'd done in competition, and it wasn't a direct correlation, but I'd probably say about 60 or 70% of those athletes that had done that appeared in the final rounds of the competition.
Okay. What would your advice be for an athlete with CP?
Good question. And a colleague of mine, Phil Fleetwood, has asked a very similar question last time round, which caused me to do a bit of reading around plyometrics, in fact, with athletes with cerebral palsy. And there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of research, if any at all, on the potentiating effect of plyometrics or heavy weights for athletes with cerebral palsy. So I can't give you a research-based or evidenced answer. But what Phil and I discussed was that some of the principles might still apply, and because of the range of disabilities that our athletes with cerebral palsy present to us, we should try and we should experiment within training to figure out what works, but definitely to apply the same ramp warm-up principles.
Okay. Outside major champs, most throws, comps are 3 rounds and occasionally 4 rounds with larger numbers of athletes. Is there potential to encourage developing athletes to exposure to 6 rounds to help them understand warm-ups, given Hammer's best is round 4?
I guess that's a structural question for how we organise competitions and what we view junior competitions for. And I think I'd probably agree. If we want to truly prepare our athletes, our developing athletes, for competitions on the bigger stages, we might need to maybe look at increasing the number of efforts, just so they can feel what it's like to hold that level of competition across 6. I know that when we go to some county champions and regional champs into English schools, that does start to change. But for junior leagues, that could be something that could be introduced.
Okay, cool. This is from Alan Risberg. Do you think the physical effect of the javelin means that better efforts come earlier due to fatigue setting in as compared to the other throws, which, as you mentioned, more rotational?
Yeah. I mean, that suggests that the javelin, well, I'm reading into the question, Alan, that you're suggesting that there is an increased level of physical effort to throw a javelin. And I would imagine that Joe Harding would probably agree with that, being an ex-thrower. But when you look at the physical efforts that are required to resist some of the loadings on landing within the triple jump, for example, those physical efforts almost pale compared to some of those. So for me, I don't think it's about the physical efforts or the loadings. I think it's more about how we're applying those efforts and how coordinated and skillful they are as our athletes are getting used to the new environments.
I mean, what's your thoughts kind of looking at major championships from a psychological perspective? That if you look at some of the top throwers, they're hitting big rounds, round 1 and 2, and putting pressure on everyone else. Mm-hmm. That'd be a contributing factor to it.
Absolutely, and we might see that within the javelin. I mean, it is supposition, and it's difficult to say. But from piecing the different pieces of the jigsaw together, it might be that there are less contextual factors that influence an athlete's ability to throw a javelin further. So you've got less to get used to. That doesn't belie the fact that it requires a high level of physical effort or skill, but that there are less environmental or contextual factors that athletes need to get used to. And then it becomes more of a psychological factor to do with resilience and adapting to change and making decisions very, very quickly about what interventions in place to make to get the best out of those efforts. And what we do know through research is that a lot of our top level of sportsmen are very good at decision making and being very resilient.
There's another question just been posed by Justin, and again, it's perhaps related to your research a little bit more in terms of looking at the strategies employed by athletes. So you've looked at the stats and looked at the percentages, but examined some of those strategies by those athletes who, navigate through the warm-ups, through the rounds as well.
Yeah, so as part of my research, one of the elements is going to be a systematic literature review, pulling together all of the different types of activities that might initiate potentiating effect. And by far and away, short sprints and heavy squats come out to be the most researched activities that are written into warm-up strategies that lead to increases in counter movement, jump, and short sprints. So those two sets of activities are thought to be the activities which lead to the most potentiating effect However, things like heavy squats, they're just not applicable within a competition arena. So there's an emerging amount of research which focuses upon more ecologically valid methodologies. So some research that I quite like at the moment is the use of jump rope activities to try and elicit a potentiating effect.
Okay, cool. This is one, some long distance athletes are not warming up less than 20 minutes. What do you advise them?
To change their warm-up strategy, to do some dynamic warm-ups, to increase the intensity at the very end, to try and get the O2 kinetics working, and maybe even to get a slight potentiating effect themselves.
Yeah. And last week we had Vern and Gambetta talk about the Gerard Mark drills and the use of them, and I think it was relating back to endurance, that those type of activities runs could form as a potentiation and preparation for training or competitions.
Yeah.
We've got one or two questions left, I think. In competition and in warm-ups, what percentage of routines and mimicking competition standards, and what percentage relaxation and general chit-chat? Christopher.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, that could be a research project in itself. And if England Athletics want to sponsor me to go to all World and Olympic Championships, to do a quantitative and qualitative analysis of this, I would be happy to do it.
Well, we'll pick that up on offline, mate. I think we've got time for one more question, and then perhaps we'll wrap it up there. What's your thoughts on having an implement to pre-warm up with? This is from Michael.
To not have an implement.
On not having
yes. Is this with regard to not having a squat rack, or maybe
throwing implement, a shot,
throwing
or
implement
prior to competing? Yeah.
There are other options of potentiating without a medicine ball. You can do some plyometric press-ups, so jumping and clapping press-ups, which could have the same effect. So whilst it's a nice to have, I don't think it's necessarily a need to have.
Cool. I think my kind of, before we wrap up, for me is certainly looking at observing athletes for many years, particularly in the horizontal jumps, where I've seen athletes be fairly sedentary between the rounds, cooling down and then stepping on the runway, and really not getting those strategies between rounds correct, that they are forever changing their approach. So they've done their 2 or 3 run-throughs, they know what the mark is, and then they sit down until they're called up. They've cooled down, the run-up shorts, the stride length's affected, they're now short of the board. Then the coach goes, right, you're a foot short, bring your run up in, but remember to do some strides, and then they foul, and they spend the whole competition going between that. So I think it's important just to be mindful of what are those strategies for each individual athlete to navigate through the rounds on that.
I think you're right, Darren, and I think the most important thing that we can take home probably for coaches is that the pre-competition routine can be something that is a bespoke and specific element to a training session. We can have our well, maybe not at the moment, but when COVID relaxes itself, we can have a session dedicated to just that. So
in preparation for the Commonwealth Games in Delhi, we took athletes and we'd done a mock competition, and we sat them in the equipment store for 45 minutes. So they got the warm up, do the mimic and mock that call room area, and then got them to do a training session, and then just looked at some strategies that they may need to adopt to ensure that they're ready for that first round to compete. So that, again, like you said, it might be something worth. It'll be interesting to set up a training session where you're going to sit the athletes, we're going to warm up, and then going to sit down for 40 minutes, and then see how they get with that. But
I think it's essential. The first time that they experience that sort of thing should definitely not be a major competition, whether it be English schools or county championships. We need our athletes to be aware of what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, guys, thanks again for signing on and spending the last hour with us. Jamie, again, thank you again for your time and preparing and delivering this evening. We are back next week with Scott Simpson on the final of his pole vault series. So I look forward to seeing you all again next week, and I hope you all have a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Stay safe.
Cheers, guys.